Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every hardship you've endured, every illness, every breathless moment, every haunting confusion, stems not from your choices, but from a legacy you never asked for. A legacy etched into your body before you were born. You come to understand that your shaking hands, your labored breathing, your persistent pain are the direct result of decisions made generations ago. Your parents, in pursuit of preserving bloodlines, made choices that would shape and shatter your life. You learn that your mother is also your cousin, your father, your uncle, your grandmother, a sister to your grandfather. The family tree doesn't branch, it coils inward, suffocating itself. You are not the product of love, but of a system built to hoard power, protect wealth, and dismiss the human cost. This isn't a horror story, it's history. For centuries, women, especially among European nobility, were born into a cycle of genetic entrapment. They were pawns in a dangerous game of dynasty, where the illusion of divine right justified marriages between close kin over and over again. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten lives, if you find value in uncovering these lesser-known corners of history, consider liking this video, subscribing for more, and letting me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. It's powerful to know we're exploring the past together, across continents and centuries. To understand the women at the heart of this story, we must first grasp the mindset that led to their suffering. For hundreds of years, royal families in Europe believed that keeping marriage in the family preserved the purity of their bloodline, even their right to rule, which they believed was granted by God. They saw themselves as fundamentally different from commoners, not just socially, but biologically. By the 1500s, nearly all of Europe's royal houses were tangled together in one vast web of cousin marriages, uncle-ness unions, and intergenerational repetition of the same names, faces, and, tragically, illnesses. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Habsburg dynasty of Austria and Spain. Their unofficial motto could have been, "Let others fight battles. You, happy Austria, marry." But those marriages weren't joyful. They were meticulous, cold arrangements that gradually warped the very bodies and minds of those born from them. Let's begin in Vienna, in the year 1634. In the dim corridors of Hofburg Palace, a baby girl is born, Marie Antoinette of Austria. From the moment of her birth, her future is shaped not by her choices, but by the damaged DNA passed down through generations of inbreeding. From her earliest memories, Marie Antoinette knew she was different. While other children played freely, she struggled to walk. Her spine twisted unnaturally, and her jaw jutted forward so severely that eating solid food was a struggle. Meals were a daily ordeal of tiny bites and cautious chewing, overseen by servants who treated her as both fragile and broken. But worse than the physical pain was the slow, agonizing realization. This wasn't a random misfortune. As she stared at portraits of her ancestors, many with the same crooked jaws, the same hunched backs, the truth set in. She wasn't alone in her suffering. She was just the latest in a long line of royal children born from the same pool of damaged genes. Doctors offered no real help. The best they could do was catalog her symptoms: the curvature of her spine, the frailty of her limbs, the shape of her skull, with cold detachment. To them, she was a case study, not a person. Suitors, often her own cousins, came and went, many turning away when they saw her condition. Even in a world where cousin marriages were normal, her visible deformities were too much to overlook. Marie Antoinette never married, not by choice, but because no one would take her. She died at just 32 years old, her body succumbing to the quiet, relentless damage of her lineage. Her death certificate listed various ailments. But the true cause, unspoken, yet understood by all, was the centuries-old obsession with keeping royal blood pure. Now, let's travel back in time, and west, to Spain, to a woman whose suffering played out not in her body, but in her mind. Joanna of Castile, born in 1479 to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, was raised to rule. Her parents were national icons, the monarchs who united Spain, expelled non-Christians, and launched Columbus across the ocean. Joanna was bright, deeply educated, fluent in several languages. She showed no signs of instability as a child, but her fate was already sealed. Her parents were cousins, part of the same closed circle of European royalty that saw marriage as a tool, not a bond. And from the moment Joanna was betrothed to Philip of Burgundy, a cold and calculating man, her life began to unravel. Philip was unfaithful and emotionally cruel. Joanna, raised to believe that her worth lay in her marriage and her ability to bear heirs, clung to him with an intensity others would later call madness. But was it madness, or simply despair? When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief took a haunting turn. She refused to bury his body. She traveled across Spain with his coffin, opening it to kiss the decaying corpse. A horrifying image, and yet, it reveals how desperately she had been starved of love, of autonomy, of real human connection. Her father, and later her son, Emperor Charles V, declared her insane and locked her away. For 46 years, she lived in confinement in the royal convent of Tordesillas, She was denied hygiene, warmth, even sunlight. Servants reported that she would scream for hours, refuse to wash, and tear her clothing to shreds. But again, we must ask, was Joanna truly mad, or was she broken by a system that demanded perfection, obedience, and silence, especially from women? These are not just tales of tragedy, they are warnings, reminders of what happens when power is placed above people, when tradition overrides compassion, and when generations are sacrificed for the sake of legacy. If stories like these resonate with you, if you believe history still has lessons to teach us, don't forget to subscribe, and let us keep this conversation going. What forgotten stories from history would you like to explore next? Modern historians now increasingly believe that Joanna of Castile's so-called madness was less a result of inherent instability and more a matter of political convenience. Labeling her as insane allowed powerful men her father, and later her son, to strip her of power and lock her away, removing a legitimate queen from the political equation. Yes, her behavior was intense, but when viewed through the lens of modern psychology, her actions aligned closely with severe depression, post-traumatic stress, and anxiety, all conditions that were exacerbated by years of isolation, grief, and emotional abuse. Her mental health struggles did not exist in a vacuum. The genetic toll of intermarriage within her royal family created fertile ground for psychological illness to take root. There's a clear hereditary pattern of mental distress running through her family line. Her great-grandmother had similar episodes, and her own daughter, Catherine, would later suffer from severe depression. Despite this, Joanna's pain was dismissed. Her confinement lasted nearly half a century. She died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially labeled mad, though her mind had likely broken long before her body did. By the time of her death, she had already been erased from the public memory, a ghost queen reduced to a footnote in a history that preferred to see her as inconvenient, rather than as a victim of both biology and politics. Our next story shifts to the grandeur of the Spanish court, where a young girl named Margaret Teresa would carry the weight of dynastic expectations in her frail, fragile frame. Born in 1651, Margaret Teresa was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece, Marie Antoinette of Austria, another uncle-niece marriage within the Habsburg dynasty. By this point, the family had become so entangled through generations of intermarriage that such unions were not only accepted, but actively encouraged. Much of Margaret Teresa's life was documented not in writing, but in paint, most famously by Diego the court painter. In his striking portraits, we see a small girl, dressed not for play, but for statecraft, corseted and crowned, standing stiffly in elaborate gowns. Though idealized, the paintings hint at physical abnormalities, a slightly prominent jaw, a gaze that seems distant, a posture that subtly reveals spinal weakness. Signs of the infamous Habsburg inbreeding are visible, even if not openly acknowledged. But the tragedy of Margaret Teresa lies not just in her physical health, it lies in how little of her life was ever truly her own. From infancy, her destiny was dictated by others. She was betrothed before she could speak to her own uncle, Leopold I, the future Holy Roman Emperor. The arrangement was hailed as a diplomatic victory. No one paused to consider what it meant for the little girl at its center. Her education was thorough languages, music, courtly manners, not for her own growth, but to make her a more polished political bride. When she turned 15, the marriage went ahead. Her new husband was not only 11 years older, but also her father's brother. Margaret Teresa was immediately expected to bear children, despite her youth and fragile health. The pressure to produce heirs was relentless. Her first child, a daughter, died in infancy. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Finally, she gave birth to a son, but even he showed signs of inherited health issues. Each pregnancy weakened her further. She likely suffered from severe anemia, respiratory complications, and possibly neurological conditions such as epilepsy. Her decline was carefully recorded by court physicians, but tellingly, they never linked her symptoms to the deeply compromised genetics of her ancestry. Instead, they treated her as an individual failure, not the inevitable outcome of centuries of deliberate inbreeding. Margaret Teresa died in 1673, at the age of just 21. The official cause was listed as fever, but it's clear her body had simply collapsed under the cumulative burden of genetic disease, repeated childbirth, and systemic neglect. Her death was mourned by the court, but more as the loss of a vessel for heirs than as the end of a young woman's life. Now, our story continues at the glittering court of Versailles, where, behind the layers of silk and ceremony, another Habsburg Princess Anna of Austria faced her own quiet suffering. Born in 1601 to Philip III of Spain and his niece Margaret of Austria, Anna was another product of dynastic union. Like so many Habsburg children, her development was slow. Her jaw protruded noticeably, making speech and eating difficult. Even in childhood, she exhibited signs of deep anxiety and depression, conditions no one at the time understood, let alone treated compassionately. At just 14 years old, Anna was married off to Louis XIII of France. The marriage was meant to secure peace between two rival powers. but it came at the cost of her happiness and emotional well-being. She was torn from her homeland, thrust into a foreign language, a foreign court, and a cold, distant marriage. Louis XIII was emotionally unavailable and struggled with personal issues of his own. Some historians believe he may have been grappling with his sexuality in a time when such struggles were repressed or punished. Whatever the cause, Anna was left in a loveless marriage, expected to serve one purpose: produce male heirs. But Anna, like many women in her family, faced great difficulty in childbirth. She suffered multiple miscarriages and lost several infants. With each loss, her emotional distress deepened. Court doctors subjected her to torturous treatments, letting, restrictive diets, humiliating examinations, all grounded in ignorance. They blamed her body, her supposed feminine faults, never considering the centuries of genetic damage she carried within her. Her isolation grew, misunderstood, overburdened, and medically abused. Anna faded into the background of history. She did eventually give birth to a son, Louis XIV, but her personal suffering was never acknowledged or addressed. She became another Habsburg woman whose life was consumed by the needs of the dynasty, whose pain was cloaked by the splendor of royal life. These women, Joanna, Margaret, Teresa, Anna, were not simply tragic footnotes in royal genealogies. They were victims of a system that prized bloodlines over lives, power over personhood. Their stories remind us that behind every gilded portrait is a real human being, often carrying invisible wounds. If this kind of deep, human-centered history resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the past. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're re-listening from, because history connects us all, across time and borders. After decades of marriage without a surviving heir, Queen Anne of Austria became the target of court gossip and whispered conspiracy. Rumors swirled that her infertility was a sign of divine disapproval, that the union between France and Spain had been cursed. Some even called for her removal, insisting France needed a more fruitful queen. The pressure broke her spirit. Today, we would recognize her symptoms as severe agoraphobia and clinical depression. Anne began to withdraw from public life, often refusing to leave her private chambers for days at a time. Her already strained relationship with Louis XIII deteriorated further. The couple lived separate lives, brought together only by the requirements of royal protocol. Seeking solace, Anne turned to religion with fervent devotion. She immersed herself in prayer, clinging to ritual as a way to impose order on her unraveling world. Then, after 23 long years of marriage, the miracle she had prayed for finally came: a healthy son, the future Louis XIV. The court celebrated the birth as a sign of divine favor. But for Anne, it brought both joy and renewed fear. She now carried the burden of needing to produce more heirs. A second son followed 2 years later, easing the court's anxiety about succession. But Anne's emotional wounds never truly healed. Years of pressure, loss, and isolation left her physically and mentally frail. Her later life was marred by chronic health issues, digestive troubles, breathing difficulties, and long spells of melancholy that left her confined to bed. Looking back, modern medicine would likely diagnose her with anxiety disorders and clinical depression, worsened by both environmental trauma and hereditary mental health vulnerabilities passed down through generations of inbreeding. Anne died in 1666, though she had fulfilled her political duty by producing a male heir. Her personal suffering was largely ignored. History remembered her for birthing a king, not for surviving decades of psychological torment. Marie Antoinette. A familiar pattern repeats. Marie Antoinette, one of the most famous figures of the French monarchy, was not just a victim of revolutionary politics, she was also the latest in a long line of Habsburg women, burdened by genetic inheritance. Born in 1755, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, Marie was a descendant of centuries of cousin marriages. Though her parents were more distantly related than earlier generations, the accumulated genetic damage still ran in her blood. At just 14, she was sent to France as part of a diplomatic alliance and married the future Louis XVI. The marriage, plagued by awkwardness and unspoken difficulties, remained unconsummated for 7 years. Gossip filled the void with rumors of frigidity, impotence, and scandal. Court physicians examined Marie Antoinette repeatedly, looking for anatomical faults. What they didn't realize was that both Marie and Louis were likely grappling with physical and psychological effects of inherited conditions, social anxiety, hormonal imbalances, and possible neurodevelopmental disorders. When Marie finally became pregnant, her struggle continued. Her first pregnancy brought extreme morning sickness and what we would now call prenatal depression. Though she eventually gave birth to a healthy daughter, subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage or the death of infants. The emotional toll was immense. Portraits of Marie Antoinette capture a beautiful queen, but they also subtly reveal the signature Habsburg traits: slightly protruding jaw, drooping lower lip, signs of inbreeding visible to any trained eye. More tragically, the behavioral symptoms of her genetic inheritance: anxiety, Mood swings, impulsiveness made it harder for her to navigate the escalating political crisis of the French Revolution. As the monarchy collapsed, her psychological fragility was exploited by her enemies. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she likely never uttered, became a symbol of indifference. Though in reality, she was more overwhelmed than cruel. During her trial and imprisonment, Marie showed moments of grace and courage, but also signs of mental breakdown. Guards described her dissociative behavior, emotional numbness, and inability to focus, symptoms consistent with trauma and depression. She was executed in 1793, a tragic end to a woman shaped by political power, public scrutiny, and inherited biological pain. The Spanish Infantas case studies in genetic collapse. While figures like Marie Antoinette became famous through drama and downfall, many lesser-known Habsburg women suffered more quietly and more severely. The Spanish royal family in the late 17th century offers perhaps the clearest example of genetic collapse through inbreeding. Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, was so inbred that his genetic coefficient, the probability of inheriting the same gene from both parents, was higher than the theoretical children of brother-sister unions. He was sterile, epileptic, and intellectually impaired. But his sisters and cousins, the Spanish Infantas, faced a different horror. They were expected to marry and produce children. Maria Margarita, born in 1651, showed signs of developmental delay from an early age. She could not speak clearly until she was 7, struggled with mobility, and may have been on the autism spectrum. Her sister Maria Theresa had epilepsy, malformed bones, and such severe respiratory issues she could barely climb stairs. Their physical impairments were obvious. Yet they were still considered viable brides because they carried royal blood. Marriage negotiations proceeded with cold calculation. Suitors were sent detailed medical reports not out of concern for the women's health, but to assess whether they could still fulfill their reproductive function. Maria Margarita was married off to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, her cousin. The marriage was predictably disastrous. Her cognitive and physical impairments made intimacy almost impossible. The trauma of such unions defies description. Palace records from this time read like a medical manual: seizures, spinal deformities, miscarriages, babies born without vital organs. Court doctors documented it all, but rarely questioned the cause. The women, meanwhile, internalized their suffering. They blamed themselves, believing their inability to bear healthy children was a personal or spiritual failure. It never occurred to them or to the men around them that the problem was systemic, rooted in centuries of genetic entrapment. The agony of these royal women can be explained by modern genetics. When close relatives reproduce, they greatly increase the risk of passing on harmful recessive traits. In a genetically diverse population, these genes are usually masked by healthy ones from the other parent. But in dynasties like the Habsburgs, where cousins married cousins for generation after generation, harmful genes accumulated unchecked. This phenomenon is called inbreeding depression. It affects not only visible traits like jaw shape, such as the infamous Habsburg jaw, but also immune function, fertility, and mental health. The tragic pregnancies, high infant mortality, seizures, mood disorders, and cognitive impairments that afflicted these women were the natural result of a deeply damaged gene pool. And yet, despite overwhelming evidence, the system persisted. Doctors recorded the symptoms, priests performed the marriages, and monarchs made the matches, all while the women suffered in silence. What makes these stories so haunting is not just the physical suffering but the dehumanization behind it. These women were seen not as people, but as vessels for political continuity. Their value lay in their wombs. Their wishes, pain, and individuality were irrelevant compared to the goal of preserving a bloodline that was already crumbling. Even more disturbing, the system wasn't just imposed from above, it was internalized. Some royal women, indoctrinated from birth, believed their noble blood made them superior. They accepted the logic of marrying within the family to protect that status, not realizing they were participating in their own genetic destruction. The Habsburg genetic experiment ended with Charles II's death in 1700. His inability to produce an heir sparked the War of Spanish Succession and brought an end to the Spanish branch of the dynasty. His body was the final warning, a man rendered incapable by centuries of inbreeding. Today, we look back on these stories with a mixture of horror and understanding. Their suffering was immense, yet it contributed to science. Modern genetics owes much to the medical records and tragedies of royal courts. The concept of recessive traits, hereditary disease, and the importance of genetic diversity were all shaped by what we learned from dynasties like the Habsburgs. But no scientific gain justifies the pain these women endured. The women at the heart of this story: Joanna of Castile, Margaret Teresa of Spain, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the forgotten Infantas of Madrid, were not merely names in a genealogy chart. They were daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers. They laughed, cried, hoped, and suffered. They were told that their worth lay in their bloodline. But history has proven otherwise. Their legacy is not their royal status or their political marriages. Their legacy is a cautionary tale warning about the cost of valuing tradition over compassion, ideology over science, and appearance over well-being. And it is a reminder that true nobility lies not in birth, but in our shared humanity.